Now, if you recall, last time we covered the first part of a chapter, and importantly covered the things that would be needed as information for the GM when writing it and constructing it for play. It was a bit of a slog, because that made the explanation rather long-winded and intricate. So this time we're going to do the second part. Only this time we're just going to bang through the narrative structure, barely taking a breath, confident in the knowledge that if you need to turn it into a usable set of module content, you have an example to base that on already. This time we're coming to our encounter area. We've got to maintain the arrangements necessary to reward and punish the players for their decisions and roles up to this point, but then write a scenario that gives them the opportunity to dust off their gloves and get down and dirty with some action. So, first things first. When I say action, I don't necessarily mean combat. This example will include combat as an option and a necessity, but it is far from the only action scene that's possible, and there's a route that will give some action without fighting, one that will give pure fighting, and one that will give a mixture of the two. Some real violence and some potentially less violent action. At this stage in the story, our players have found, in some manner or other, Ramirez. They have identified somehow that she's meeting someone called Smitty at the Green Room, a bar. There are a number of things that could have happened during this information gathering. For example, Ramirez might not have survived, or might have been incapacitated, which means she's not going to make the meeting. Alternatively, she might be going to the meeting unaware she's being tracked, or she might have worked that out. Meanwhile, Smitty might know Ramirez is compromised, or he might not, and depending on the way the players approach the Ramirez problem, they might get to the bar before her or after her. In fact, they might even beat Smitty to the scene. Which sounds like an awful lot of options, and you're already thinking that we're only halfway through the chapter. How many options will we have to cope with by the end, if every choice branches into more choices? Fewer is the answer, or at least not as many significant differences. There will be differences in the order things happen, the way in which they happen, but the real plot differences will be just slightly more limited. And the players won't mind, because it won't feel like that to them. Let's get started, and I'll show you how it works. First, we need the bar. We need a map, a few NPCs, and a layout of tables and other furniture. Not too complicated, but remember this might turn out to be the scene of some violence. Hey Socks! So make sure the scale of it suits the rules you're using. In other words, it's okay to have narrow winding passages, but remember they provide much greater benefits for the characters that are fewer in number. If you're playing D&D, Traveller, quite a lot of systems really, there should be a grid on the map with a scale of 1.5 meters or 5 feet, which is basically the same. Some systems might actually suit different scales. With D&D, even an outdoor scene should be scaled that way, probably, but for Traveller and some other systems, give a thought to characters that might have the capacity to engage at well over 500 meters. If you do that in the normal scale, then you're going to end up with a map that's hundreds of squares across, and that might prove unwieldy. In this case, think about lines of sight and cover as appropriate. You don't have to pander to the skill set of the player character, but you should avoid being unjust about it as well. Making a bar circular, with no furniture and no obstructions, makes the map nice and simple, but it's rather mean if there's a rogue in the party. In this case, it's going to be important that the bar's exterior is also mapped, not only so the players can creep up if they're the last to arrive, but also because the bar has a dark, dirty back alley behind it. And now we've got a bar, we need to look at who's coming. Oh, and when. If the players got access to all of the messages between Smitty and Ramirez, then they can get to the bar before either of them, if that's what they choose to do. If Ramirez has warned Smitty that she's been hacked, or is being followed, then Smitty won't turn up at all, but he'll send a couple of thugs to make sure Ramirez can't lead anyone to Smitty. It does allow you to do that, exactly. So Smitty will arrive before Ramirez, or the two henchmen will arrive before Ramirez. Possibly the PCs will arrive before Ramirez, or maybe they'll arrive later. So what happens next? For our purposes, I'm obviously not going to lay out stat blocks for anyone, nor their weapons and equipment. I don't even know which system the scenario might be played in, after all. What I will do is say that here, if not before, we need stats for Ramirez, Smitty, and the two henchmen. We're going to call them Burke and Hare. Then, what goes down in the bar is entirely player-driven. All we have to do is decide the motivations for the people being there. So, Ramirez is there to get Smitty to smuggle her to safety, find her a new identity, get her out of the city. Smitty is there to kill Ramirez, but he won't do it in the bar. Instead, he'll get her to his vehicle, take her somewhere private, and kill her there. Or more accurately, get Burke and Hare to do it. If Burke and Hare are there instead of Smitty, they'll try to kill Ramirez, but they'll lure her outside into the dark alley to do that. So we already have a new location to think about, the private place where Smitty wants to take Ramirez. If the players don't intervene, the two of them will travel there. Smitty will tell Burke and Hare to kill Ramirez and dump her body at the rear of this new building, an industrial one. But if Burke and Hare are waiting for Ramirez, they'll explain that Smitty sent them to get her, and will then take her outside, ostensibly to take her to Smitty, who they will explain is outside, but actually all that awaits her out there is death, because they'll kill her in the alleyway. How all this goes down is, in fact, down to the players, and the GM has plenty of options to use to tell the tale. There might be a fight inside, or outside. Ramirez might end up thanking the PCs for saving her life, or might, foolishly, fight alongside the criminals to defeat the PCs. Whatever happens, however, these are the outcomes. Smitty will go to the new location, a grubby-looking industrial unit. Burke and Hare might be there the whole time, or might attempt to go there from the bar. Ramirez will be taken there, or left dead in the alley, or rescued by the players. But our next location is the industrial unit, and we need to make sure the players can find it. They can follow Smitty or Burke and Hare, of course. They can find the location on the body of any of those three as well. If they're too late to save Ramirez and to follow anyone, then they still have options. Firstly, if they have complete control of Ramirez's electronics, they can follow those, because the baddies will take them with them. Secondly, they can follow clues they overheard at the bar. And finally, if all else fails, the bartender will be able to give them the relevant information because he has overheard something. It might be expensive in terms of tongue-loosening cash, but it's doable. That's exactly what we're doing, Socks. We're talking about the way the story funnels down. But no spoilers. It's coming. In case they don't think of any of these, the GM can make the bartender run over to, for example, a dead body, explain that he's calling the police, and report to the police the things he heard. Loudly. He can report them very loudly. Now that's an awful lot of hand-holding in that case, so the PCs get no extra points if you have to do that. So ultimately, at the end of this scene, how many narratively different options do we have? 1. That's it. Ramirez has served her purpose. Burke and Hare are irrelevant as well, except as something to fight. It's all about the new location and Smitty, assuming he hasn't been killed by the party. But it doesn't feel that way because there are a large number of routes. that the PCs might have used to get to the new location. And many of them feel rewarding because they required skills or combat or imaginative thinking. Remember, always railroad, but never let them catch you doing it. So I suppose the question becomes, why on earth isn't this funneling down to a single real choice considered a gate? If you've forgotten, as obviously Socks hasn't, a gate is one of the key steps the players have to get through in order to complete the story, like a boss fight or a major objective, and it's unavoidable. Now this one isn't a gate, because, important piece of storytelling craft here, the players aren't aware that this is a gate. It's important sometimes that they blunder into an unknown situation that escalates quickly. It's exciting, but a gate happens only when the players already know that everything's at stake, at least everything so far. This is a choke point in the story, but the players won't necessarily know that. Which means they won't necessarily take risks, or try to succeed really quickly, or feel devastated if something goes wrong. And this matters because not everything in a story is life or death. I mean, except for Ramirez. For her, this part is life or death. Some things are lower intensity. Roller coasters aren't all fast descents. Horror films aren't all stabbing. This is a story beat, full of action and speed, but not a critical chapter break. And one more thing, just worth mentioning, that's an oddity of tabletop RPGs, but also shared by screenplays and not finished films. Action, which we think of as being fast and intense, is actually the slowest part of a TTRPG to play through. Suddenly it takes a fair amount of time to complete just a few seconds of a game. So now, we have an address to go to, and we could stop here and move on next time. But we're not going to, because you've actually seen how both narrative choices are written for the players, and how scenes and sequences are written for the characters to enjoy and endure. So we're actually going to finish this part of the scenario off with the final push to the gate. Now I do seem to recall, back in the mists of time, that I promised there was a possible action scene that didn't involve combat. I know we were all much younger then. If you haven't already marched way ahead of me, and there's every chance you have, this is where, instead of actual fighting, you could have a car chase. I mean, sure, it's a cyberpunkish car chase, so it might be flying cars, or the chase might go through buildings, or underground and then back out again. There might be weapons used, or just the thrill of the chase. In this situation, I would be tempted to provide a map showing the available routes to allow the PCs to cut off the baddies if they like. And then, if the actual combat system calls for it, possibly a blown-up section of roadway that can represent any section of the journey and, as necessary, can be reused, which you can use for those moments during the chase that there might be 3 completely different occasions when the players get close enough to fire pistols out of windows at the fleeing terrorists. Each time, you pull out that roadway map and have at it. Without knowing the exact details of the system used, I can't easily imagine the best way to represent this graphically, which is also not my greatest strength. But, as a general guide, maps are intended to help people visualise things, so they can be as basic or as detailed as necessary for that purpose. Now this chase could be filled with fighting and death, of course, but it could just as easily be filled with a desperate game of high-stakes manoeuvring as the players try to keep on the tail of the speeding NPCs. It's still action-filled, just not necessarily terminal. What makes it full of action is, depending on your definition, either the pitch of the storytelling, where the objectives are now capable of slipping through the player's fingers in a single instant, or, if you want to be more prosaic, because people are frequently rolling skill checks and getting instant results, just like in combat. Anyway, on to the next part of the story. When they arrive at the industrial location, the players won't necessarily know this yet, but this is actually going to be the place where the baddies are mass producing the weapon. Now, Remember, they essentially have two objectives to complete in this whole adventure. Take down the factory and stop the terrorist attack. This is the factory. It must be taken down. The players know this, and their characters know this. I mean, not yet, but they will. The stakes are high, the baddies are numerous, the scene is set, and we have hinged victory or defeat on a single, carefully poised moment. This is a gate. So we get to the factory, and we find, well, another map for a start. This could get a bit fighty. First, a quick recap. The terrorist group F3 captured Signagene technology from the Intron Corporation, and they're planning to do two things with it. Some of the material is being replicated on a grand scale in a factory to allow F3 to offer this technology to anyone who wants it, for money, spreading evil across the realm. The rest of the material, already configured to find Intron employees, is being taken to a big trade show, where it can be used as a public demonstration of the power of the weapon, killing only the Intron people in a huge hall filled with people who aren't targets. It's been a while since we explained that part of the plot, so I thought it might be worth a quick reminder. We finally arrived at the factory, the first of our actual objectives. This also means we finally meet the first of the bosses that must be defeated, disgraced scientist Joseph Harvey. This is going to be a gate, a major resolution point, so we've got to make sure we achieve a few essential things. The players have to know that this is going to be a big challenge. The players have to be appropriately rewarded if they succeed, and the events here have to kick off the clock, making them focus on the next part of the story. So how do we achieve these? When the PCs arrive at the factory, it's seemingly deserted. This is, of course, deceptive. Aside from the fact they'll probably be there in time to see Smitty or Burke and Hare enter the factory, or at least know that was their intended destination, there are all sorts of investigative checks they could do, from sneaking up and peering in through the windows to scanning the building for infrared. In practice, the players will come up with their own ideas. They do that all the time. It's irritating. The factory is actually very busy, with lots of people and plenty of running scientific equipment. So here's a little tip for you. Players quantify risk in a number of ways, but one of them is in terms of the number of potential enemies they face. If you want people to know the challenge is formidable, give them 15 enemies to fight. RPG rules usually make it possible to ensure that the 15 enemies are weak enough to be defeated, but still, they're 15 in number. That ensures the players know how risky it is. It's the reason D&D has kobolds in it. The players will know this is a gate because you tell them so. Not directly, of course. It's a big facility. There are a lot of guards, chemical smells, industrial noises. The exterior is unlit for concealing its purpose. Many vehicles are parked around it and they've been concealed from view. Everything points to this moment being intense. You'll know you've done it right when the players start talking about how to plan the breaching of the building and counting how many grenades they each have. As for rewards, they should be able to find things that will help them here. Probably the most important thing is that this factory is also the place where the convention centre attack was planned. Information litters the place that will be useful for thwarting the attack. There are also likely to be more tangible things. Weapons, medical supplies, that sort of thing. We have to think in terms of the design of the map. Essentially, there are going to be a bunch of unnamed, interchangeable terrorist guards. That's your first defensive ring. You can fight them or avoid them, but one way or another you have to get past them, and they will be numerous. And these are the enemies that you already know you have to face. Then you'll have to deal with Burke and Hare. Again, there's every chance you know that they're going to be resisting you. Oh, Kelly. Finally, Harvey and potentially Smitty will be the toughest challenge. Depending on the way the approach takes place, the last two could be happening simultaneously, but the golden rule here is that the final boss has to be fought in his lair, because we've actually built a lair. Harvey, even once he knows the factory is under attack, will not charge out. He's obsessed with his scientific study, and when cornered, he'll make use of the equipment. He will, for example, assume that the attackers are likely to be Intron people, so he'll flood the factory with a lethal gas that naturally will have no effect on anyone. But that's what we call foreshadowing. Smitty will stay with Harvey to protect him. Burke and Hare will join the outer defenders, or will join Harvey or Smitty, or will fight as an intermediate encounter. As the GM, you choose based on how easily the players are dealing with the first part of the combat. Burke and Hare are a bit more of a threat than the Kobold Guards. Smitty is, in practice, the most lethal person here with conventional weapons, but Harvey will throw acids, start fires, do all sorts of chemical things as well. So our map contains a perimeter area filled with guards, a working area filled with Burke and Hare and some sciencey stuff, and a final central laboratory and office for Harvey and Smitty. In that office can also be found enough information to understand how the attack at the conference centre is going to be launched, and depending on the success of the players, some useful clues to get them not only to the right place, but also forearmed with some beneficial knowledge. This fight must actually be consequential. Bad rolls should be a death sentence, just not the very first bad roll, okay? Insta-death isn't much fun for anyone. Hopefully, if you've judged it right, the PCs are now a bit exhausted, possibly somewhat injured, and definitely covered in grime and reeking of toxic gas. And oh yes, the conference centre isn't going to want to welcome these scruffy-looking terrorist herders with open arms. Yet, if they want to earn their reward, the players have to get there. And fast. Cassandra, evil terrorist leader, is about to demonstrate the true power of the dark side of the genetic revolution. Before they go, the PCs might opt to destroy the factory, or they might simply let Intron know where it is and that the coast is clear. And just one more note before we call time on this part of the story. They might be so intimidated by the number of enemies to face that they call in Intron security to help in the assault. That's something Intron wanted to avoid, if you recall. So they'll be resistant to that idea. But if they roll well, or are particularly effective at explaining the problem, or even if they declare they simply aren't built for such assaults and won't do that part of the mission, then some Intron heavies will turn up. And they'll be useless, of course, because as soon as battle is joined, they'll be killed by the lethal gas. But if that doesn't teach the party that they're on their own, nothing will. Next time we'll finish up with the conference, Cassandra, and what happens if the players have decided to be terrorists all along.